Hello, my name is Jennifer Sertl. Welcome to Studio A3R. I just want to acknowledge Anthony Molina for that amazing opening music, which is fantastic. Studio A3R is about 4 questions, and we will be asking guests from all over the world how they're actually preparing for change, how they're navigating complexity and ambiguity. And the 4 questions are, where have you been? What have you learned? Where are you going? What is required? We're very privileged today to welcome Daniel Christian Wahl from Spain, actually, who has been, he's an author and a thought leader, and his most marked characteristic is his capacity for lateral thinking and his passion for weaving the unbroken whole into tapestries of meaning that can guide appropriate participation. There's a lot to unpack just in that sentence there, but he's also someone for the last 10 years I've been following on Twitter. He's been published by Triarchy Press, and he's just been someone that I think is really urgent about creating meaning in this current mode. And so I am so lucky to welcome you to the show. Welcome to the show, Daniel.
Thank you for inviting me.
So when you were thinking about the questions, I would love you just to go ahead and dive in and let's figure out where these questions take us. Every once in a while, I might ask for more. And Scott Fitzgerald, the producer of the show, sometimes has an additional perspective that he'll pop in as well. And so I think this will be a great ride. And I think of, you'd mentioned an airplane outside of your window and you're on an island in Spain. I feel like we're just about to embark on a journey and my seatbelt is fastened.
Great. Well, where have I been? I grew up in Germany, and my mother raised me on the poetry of Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and he also famously wrote Faust. And in Faust, there is this monologue where he asks himself about what holds the world together in its innermost core. And to some extent, that question has been leading me on an apprenticeship and pilgrimage for the last 48 years of my life. It led me to becoming a biologist and realizing that I could spend my life studying a particular species of dolphin, and most likely my great-grandchildren would only know that dolphin or of that species from a natural history book, because by then it would have gone extinct. And so I started to look more into my own species behavior and understand even more, because being a scientist at the time was a very reductionist business, trying to reduce the magnificence and beauty of the natural world to what is quantifiable and statistically significant. And I really disliked that. So I turned away from science and only later discovered that there was something called a Master's in Holistic Science at Schumacher College, where all the studies were focused on scientific disciplines that were trying to understand the whole in a participatory way. I had the good fortune to still get to know Brian Goodwin, one of the co-founders of the Santa Fe Institute of Complexity and one of the founding fathers of complexity science. And Brian always put it that once you understand that complex dynamic systems are fundamentally unpredictable and uncontrollable, the aim of science changes from prediction and control and manipulation of the natural world to appropriate participation. How do we participate appropriately in this nested wholeness and complexity that brought us forth, in ways that enable more future to happen, rather than degenerate life's capacity to create conditions conducive to life. And it was mainly because I realized that the community scale of action is critically important, but the whole system's design of creating truly regenerative systems and working on refitting the human impact on Earth to the biophysical conditions of and uniqueness of each ecosystem actually had to happen at the bioregional scale. And islands being islands, they're very well-defined bioregions, because as soon as your feet get wet, you're off the bioregion. So they're perfect case studies for embarking on how would someone, without predicting, controlling, and manipulating the system, participate in an island community and ecosystem in such a way that my actions foster health, wholeness, vitality, community resilience, and ultimately the regeneration of the local economy and the restoration of local ecosystems. And that's a journey that I've been on for the last 10 years. And yeah, I think that's enough for that question.
Are there, just thinking about where you've traveled and both your own experience, are there maybe 3 lessons that the past has taught you that are meaningful for where you're going in the future? Like, are there anything that's true no matter where you've been as a core principle, perhaps?
Well, one of them is possibly don't get hung up on the destination, but pay attention to the way you're traveling there. Meaning that I think for quite some time I thought, or was still stuck in a mental frame that seemed to suggest that sustainability or a regenerative culture is some blueprint, some prototype that you can come up with and then implement, and then you're there, then you arrive. And what I've really learned over the last 20 years is that the journey is what it's all about. That because this nested wholeness continuously changes and evolves and transforms, we need to be able and willing to continuously change, evolve, and transform. And we need to be able to tug on our masks and question our roles and question our ingrained patterns with regard to whether they still serve and whether they're still relevant in the new context. And so that's why I now believe that sustainability and regeneration is a community-based process of learning with others, of living the questions, rather than some kind of well-defined destination that we'll ever reach.
Right. It almost, it's so interesting. I hear a little bit of Rilke in that, like live into the question. It's fascinating. I
opened my book with that quote.
Yay! Yeah,
that's to a young poet by Rilke. You have to live the question.
What I think is so beautiful, just kind of my own experience of this conversation is, it seems as if our culture causes there to be, you have to be either liberal arts or you have to be scientific. And even from the way you introduced yourself from a poet's perspective, that your journey has been informed by both poetry and by science, which is fascinating. I have never quite heard the phrase how you travel. Pay attention to how you travel, the way in which you said it. It wasn't just the words, it was the timbre in which you said how you travel. Can you just speak a little bit more about the mindfulness of how one travels? That is really interesting. Scott, did you catch that?
I did, and I'm actually, to be honest, I'm still trying to absorb everything that he's done. I'm a very creative person. I'm like more on the poet side than on the science side, and you seem to have a very great combination of the two. I definitely lack on the science side, so I'm liking where this is going because I feel like I'm going to learn a lot.
That's really lovely. And again, I just think how one travels, there's really something here I'd like us to unpack a little more.
Just briefly back to there is that's why Goethe was so important. It still remains important for me in my life, because Goethe he's famous for being one of the German arch poets. He's like Germany's Shakespeare, or
right.
what is Cervantes in Spain. But he was a poet and a scientist, and the way he did science might yet become guiding towards the kind of science we're now beginning to move into. Actually, Brian Goodwin, who I mentioned earlier, always said that complexity theory is a science of qualities, and Goethe's way of working with science was a science of qualities. Before Gregory Bateson and Maturana and Varela, Goethe saw that there is a perceptual, conceptual component in how we see the world. This was pre-Heisenberg saying what we observe is not nature, but nature exposed to our method of questioning. Goethe understood that from the beginning. And this links a little bit to how do we travel, because I think we need to bring all our 4 ways of knowing to the journey. We need to not just know the world, but feel the world, sense the world, and intuit the world in response to being participants and co-creators of it. And that's why I very much like this image of walking as a pilgrim, which is a very different way of walking the land than to travel in order to see distant places that and collect them like a little jewel box that you can say, oh, I've been to this place, been to that place. Rather, it is an apprenticeship of in meeting other people in other places to let those places and people repattern you and transform you. So like Marcel Proust said, the true journey of discovery is not seeking new landscapes, but in seeing with new eyes. And it's that ability to constantly try to see with new eyes, which is not easy because we all fall into a groove that I've tried to remain true to, and I still have the practice of asking myself, where am I getting stuck in my own groove?
Right. You know, you had mentioned the 4 ways of knowing that we know through our own studies, but I don't think everyone on our program actually knows the 4. Would you be kind enough to reframe them just to give people access to the 4 ways of knowing that you had just mentioned?
It's Carl Gustav Jung who suggested that there are basically 4 ways of knowing, and the intellect, the analytical mind, the thinking mind is only one of them. And we need to also have the kinesthetic, the sensing, the embodied ability to know the world engaged, and the emotional feeling side engaged, which is the 3rd way. And then the way I understand intuition is this direct knowing of when you engage fully with these other 3 senses, you participate not as an observer, but as an emergent property of what you're observing.
Right.
And because of that, you're actually in direct knowing because you're part of it. And so out of that can come an intuitive insight of what is actually going on that I believe ultimately most of us make our life decisions out of that intuition, even if our mental mind doesn't quieten down to the point that we're actually realizing that who really calls the shots is intuition and feeling and not our mind.
That's great. I'm also still processing, Scott, so I'm right with you. You had mentioned qualities, like I'm thinking the science as we have known it, particularly in Western culture, is the science of facts and the science of knowing. You had mentioned the science of quality, or there was something that you said that I thought I caught. I was like, I got to ask him about this, and now I'm like, really got to ask you about it. Something about something about qualities of quality, or
no, well, I mean, basically, ours is a science, or the conventional science has become a science of quantities.
There we go.
It goes back to some extent to Galileo dividing the world into qualities and measurable attributes, and basically saying that science was all focused on what is measurable.
Yeah.
And really what brings the world together and what brings forth the world is the intricate web of relationships and interactions and information flows in a fundamentally interconnected system that has never been separate, apart from when we use organizing ideas that separate stuff out.
Yeah.
And so we really need to move science beyond this bias of only being quantitative and analytically focused, and not dismiss the usefulness of that tool, but put it into a context of really understanding that what makes life worth living and what creates conditions conducive to life is all about the qualitative relationships. And there is a rebirth of this science of qualities in many different ways happening around the world now.
Right. It seems through listening to you that the path forward also includes the past. It's almost as if there's a correction going on now. Maybe I think of, the next question in our series is kind of, where are you going? And I feel that somehow we missed a mark and have to almost go back and reread and relearn science and how science originally came about. Am I hearing and processing in a way that's respectful to your journey?
What came to my mind when you asked the question is that I often have this image that because we tend to think about where are we now and where are we going in terms of paradigm shifts,
yes,
from this to that, and then you get these long lists of we're leaving this behind and we're moving towards this, and some people might call it we're moving from ego to eco or from me to we, and in that framing is the potential trap of oversteering yet again. I think that in the history of humanity more than once we've thrown out the baby with the bathwater because we got so irritated with the negative side effects of an outdated way of seeing and being in the world, that when we finally decided to change, we then changed to the extreme other side of whatever the opposing antithesis of that is. And I think we're really called into synthesis now in order to stop this swinging to and fro. So for me, a healthy, life-generating, regenerative participation in this nested wholeness that is life as a planetary process means that I need to be fully integrated as me, in order to then be able to serve the we and the eco. The ego needs to serve the eco. There's nothing negative in a fully, healthily integrated ego that understands that all life lives in this tension between being for oneself and being as part of a larger whole. And that wholeness is not additive in one part and another part, and then you have the whole, but that both the whole and the part enable each other. And that's this and this again, this is where the science of quality is pointing us, where we're beginning to see that our consciousness, the way we process our observation of the world, while we also process our thinking at the same time, this dual experience we all have, that we kind of live in our inner space and we live in a material outer world, and bringing the two of them together for me is critical. And on that journey, what often happens is that if you're on the journey from one extreme to the other extreme, and then you realized you overstood and you walk back on that pendulum swing, everybody who comes towards you is still running away from the other extreme. And so when they hear you speak about synthesis and the need to hold both perspectives and to integrate and to value where you've come from, then they very much assume that you're actually behind them in the journey and that you haven't quite got it yet. But what you're actually trying to do is say, yeah, this is wonderful and it's really important, and don't forget what is the gifts of the past. And this, like in terms of your question of what are the things we need to pick up, well, we certainly need to revisit indigenous wisdom and the way that our species has for most of its history lived in intimate reciprocity with the places it inhabited. And we've somehow, with globalization, lost that connection with place and local ecosystems. And we lost the art of the long view, understanding that we are part of the earth and not the earth doesn't belong to us. And that therefore we need to care, as many indigenous cultures did in one way or another, about the seventh generation, the famous Iroquois nation wisdom. And that doesn't mean that we need to suddenly go back to the golden past of indigenous wisdom. We need to integrate that knowledge with the best of science to move forward into a new form of participation. Owen Barfield called the participation of indigenous cultures original participation, and they had a lot of procedural knowledge around how to be with ecosystems in a regenerative way, but not necessarily explicit knowledge of how to manage and how to, like, not knowledge that they could transfer to other people, only in relationship to their immediate environment. So now we have an opportunity to take these streams of knowledge and integrate them into a new way of being in the world that makes the human species once again a careful keystone species in each of the ecosystems it is in, with the intention of increasing bioproductivity, health and wholeness, vitality of that ecosystem, in the understanding that individual health, community health, ecosystems health, and planetary health are all fundamentally interconnected, and we can't work on one without working on the other.
Do you happen to be a Ray Bradbury fan, or have you read, as I was listening to you, I was thinking of Ray Bradbury has a short story called All Summer in a Day, and it's about a girl named Margot who had actually seen the Earth before, and she's ostracized because of where she had been and the lack of respect of what she could teach. You know, at least that's probably, that's a thin slice of a perspective of the reading. It's unfortunate in our culture that people, like you are so graceful in not needing to justify. Like, you know compassionately that you've been on this journey and you're coming back here. And many people that may be seeing you might not know where you've been. And I just really felt respectful of how competitive our culture is, and how sometimes it's just to take a step back and realize that we never know where a person's been or what they've learned. And we don't know if they're a student or if they're a teacher. And most likely they're more a teacher than we think they are, just because our culture is more likely to discount where a person's been. Just my own experience of what hearing what you've said.
I mean, I would also say, like, this reminded me of sort of advice on how to travel. Well, one piece of advice would be treat every person you meet as a potential teacher. I think, and I often think that when I sit on a public transport, like a bus or something like that, and I see old people and how ostracized and marginalized they sometimes sit there quietly, kind of minding their own business, and we don't know what their story is and what they've done in their lives and how much we owe to what they've done in their lives.
Yeah.
And I think it's often something that, again, if we learn from our species past, we learn that honoring your elders is a step to becoming a wiser culture.
Yeah.
And you have to relearn that.
Scott, I'm about to move on, but I want to make sure that anything that you see as an observation or anything you want to add.
I love the concept of going back to more respect for elders. It's something that I've been personally I don't want to say a big fan of, but I've been looking into that and trying to learn more from the stories from people from the past and people who have gone through. There's so much that we can learn. And I think something, especially in the United States, I don't know how it is in Spain, but in the United States, there's a bit of there's a lack of respect for history and what we can learn from history here. And as a history buff, that really bothers me. So I really appreciate that point, and I agree. I think that the more human beings think about their elders and what their elders can still offer, I think that would, really help us progress as a race.
Yeah, a teacher and friend of mine often says, she has this way of saying, the ancients say, and then she quotes important things. And she often says, the ancients say that trying to create your future without knowing your history is like planting cut flowers.
Oh,
and I find
wow.
that's a beautiful image.
Yeah. I that's amazing.
I just briefly wanted to pick you up on one thing you said, Jennifer, which was that we're in such a competitive culture. And while, of course, we can see a lot of competition around us and we all experience it in interactions, I actually feel that partially we repeat that meme so often that we really believe it. But if you really think of the functioning of a community or a city, the way you drive on a road and you most people behave in a certain way that enables traffic to move without even more accidents, surprisingly few accidents. Or similar way, if you look at how few violent interactions there really are in a big city compared to the gazillions of interactions that there are every day, I think we're just paying too much attention to this competitive nature that is like, I often use the image, when you stand in front of the ocean, of course you get drawn to the clashing waves and the sound of the surf, but below that noisy and clashing and energetic surface that it does exist, there is an ocean of symbiosis and working together and collaboration. I think that our species' unique evolutionary jump has been our ability to collaborate, and we would have not become such a prevalent species had we not learned that very early on in the savannas of Africa. And beyond that, actually, every evolutionary jump in the history of life on Earth has been enabled by new forms of collaboration and cooperation. We're a bit too over-focused on competition in the story.
I love that. And having driven in Rome and survived, I think that what I'll do, because again, I'm in a culture, I'm a product of my culture. I keep hearing this cancer culture conversation. It's so sad to me because I'd like it to be a transcendent conversation, right? Don't cancel. Don't talk about cancel, transcend. But in my own transcendence with an apprentice to this conversation, I love the idea that when I feel that sense of competition, that I actually think of Rome and driving in Rome, and how when you get through it, you think it was amazing we got through it, and we got through it just fine. And we'll get through this just fine as well. Let's move more to your journey, where you're headed. Where are you headed? Both in your, and this, I was about to say in your work and in your life, realizing how unintegrated that question is.
Well, maybe where I'm headed is where I sense we're all invited to head right now, which is a coming home, a coming home to who we really are, to our place, to what really matters, to how to make a difference, how to serve. And for me, that's been a bit of a journey since my book came out in 2016. I've increasingly started to focus on advocacy and international network weaving and collaborations that were all wonderful work, but that drew my attention to the global meta conversation around how do we turn this one around and how do we respond to the current converging crises. And apologies for the stuck buzzer in the background. I can't do anything about it. I hope it stops soon. This is irritating. Sorry about that.
It's real. We're getting pressure tested.
Yeah. But it has completely killed my flow of thought right now. Coming home. I hope this is, can we cut this out at the end? Yeah, now it stops.
Okay, coming home.
Sorry about that.
Oh, it's wonderful.
Right. Yeah, we are, I personally feel that there's a real need to ask, where do I put my attention and what is my sphere of influence and how can I best serve right now? And for me, that has become more and more a process of relocalization and re-regionalization, and coming back to why I moved to this island 10 years ago and engaging with building community resilience, local relationships in a real embodied 3D world beyond the Zoom screen, and walking my talk fully in the way I engage with my family, my community, and the region I live in. And then, if anything, use my international work to bring in collaborations from elsewhere in the world that focus on my work locally, or take the lessons from what I do locally and share it with an international network, but it's a kind of reshifting of my focus of attention, for which maybe in the last few years has been 80% global and 20% local over the last 3 or 4 years, and bring it back to being much more locally focused. And I have a little daughter who's only 3 years old, and I'm very committed to that. The next 3 years are about me helping her discover the world in new ways, and living with her what a regenerative lifestyle might look like, rather than spending my time online talking about it and then telling her Daddy doesn't have time because he has another Zoom call. It's happened a few too many times in the last few years that I had to tell her that I needed to go to work now. And right now I feel it's very important to pay attention to our families and our communities, and that's where I'm heading, at least for a while.
You know, it's almost as if great noble work is taking care of the family, and there's nobility. You know, it's almost it creates in my mind the idea of congruence between what you teach and how you live at a very personal level. What is required, if you think of, and even maybe that question is a little bit more of the a past paradigm versus the integral paradigm that you're bringing forward. But if someone, what is required to live the life that you're living and living into?
Well, congruence, you mentioned, is a key word for me. Buckminster Fuller famously said, "In the end, only integrity is going to count."
Wow. That's a. I feel like I'd like you to say that one more time.
In the end, only integrity is going to count. If we all bring forth a world together, then that means each and every one of us has a responsibility for what world we are bringing forth. And if we keep talking about it and not live it the way we're talking about it, then we're not fully living our potential. And for me, that's really important, that I feel incongruent if I talk about bioregional regeneration and how to regenerate local economies, if I don't at least try to engage with multi-stakeholder networks where I live, or in the process of exploring what that might look like where I live.
Right.
And of course, I can't force anything here. I'm a guest on this island. I'm not even from here. But over the years, I've worked with others that are aligned and seeded processes that are now beginning to come to fruition, and so that very practice of trying to walk your talk is right foremost in my mind. And
right. Wow.
the question is, what is required? Well, again, thinking of this mentor that I've already mentioned a couple of times, Brian Goodwin, he once said to me in a conversation, Daniel, like two quotes by him. One of them, the aim is not to discover the meaning of life, but to live a life of meaning. There's one thing that he gifted me that I think is with me as what is required to ask that question: am I living a life of meaning? And the other thing is to live, he said to me once, to live a full life, you have to be willing in every moment to give up who you are for what you could become. And I feel like that's so significant for us individually in this changing time now, but it's also collectively as a species. We now have to really ask, what patterns have we created that are so ingrained, that so clearly don't serve life and don't serve our communities and don't serve the majority of humanity? And how do we move into a space of letting go of those patterns and getting comfortable with the collapse around us as actually being part of the unleashing of potential and new creativity as rigid patterns dissolve? And in that chaos, we can find the creativity to reinvent ourselves and co-create a more meaningful path into the future. And I believe that needs to be done collectively in community and in a way that is sourced out of the uniqueness of place and local culture. So one thing that is required is deep listening and a willingness to keep learning and to keep changing. And a coming home to place in order to create the personal and community resilience to be able to weather the uncertainties that are coming at us in the next few decades, because the world is a very turbulent place now, and in the next 2 to 3 decades, I think, are the decades where the fate of our species will be decided in so many ways. Uh-huh. And the jury is still out whether we can avoid cataclysmic runaway climate change, but the pathway to preparing for it and the pathway to avoiding it, to my mind, is very similar, which is engage with your local community to heal the ecosystems where you are at, and engage in global solidarity with all other people everywhere else, and in supporting them to be able to do the same journey in their place and in their bioregions. We can only avoid the cascading ecosystems collapse that we're currently seeing all around the globe if all of us take responsibility for healing our local ecosystems. And in engaging in that collective endeavor, understanding that now it's actually very real that the enlightened self-interest is to work in the interest of the larger whole, the health of the planet, we will then find the social connections again and our common ground that will heal our communities and also create the uniquely adapted to biocultural uniqueness of place innovations and ecosystems and businesses, like ecosystems of businesses and ecosystems of organizations that actually will also lead to economic regeneration and more work for people, but in a much more regionalized way.
Right. You know, you didn't state it, but I think what is required is humility. And in even the way that you've answered the questions, there is I don't even know how to describe it except for I experienced the word humility. It's wonderful. So then Studio A3R is just about the 4 questions. And so I'm glad that you're, part of this conversation. And before I close, Scott, is there anything you'd like to add?
I'm just happy that you were the guest on this show, because I love to get insight from folks who live abroad, folks who live in other countries, and you've been traveling the world, and I think when you travel the world, that gives you the kind of perspective that I believe more people should have, that perspective, because you learn from different cultures, you learn from different points of view. And having only one point of view is one of the biggest problems that I find in this country. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I leave this conversation hungry for more. Like what I look forward to is learning, maybe as you as the teacher, on how one travels. I think there's a lot around that. I think the art of participation is something that I feel that we should pay more attention to. I didn't realize, as we were speaking earlier, that we both have a deep respect for David Whyte and his work, but I had no idea that you also had the background that he had to study science in the same way. Would you be willing to close today with Lost?
Which is not by David Whyte, but by David Wagner.
Right. But it's, when I think of poetry and I think of modern day poets, I definitely think of David Whyte, and I learned through our process together that he was a significant person for you. And I did ask Daniel for a significant poem, and because today's talk has been about where we've been and where we're going, he had mentioned David Wagner, and I would love our program to be closed today with Lost.
Gladly. Okay. Lost. Stand still. The trees ahead and the bushes beside are not lost. Wherever you are is called here. and you must treat it as a powerful stranger. Must ask permission to know it and be known. The forest breathes. Listen, it answers. I have made this place around you. If you leave it, you may come back again, saying, here. No two trees are the same to raven. No two branches are the same to wren. If what a tree or a bush does is lost on you, you are surely lost. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. Stand still. The forest knows where you are. You must let it find you.
Wow. Oh, so beautiful. Stand still. I'd like to thank our producer, Scott Fitzgerald at ROC Vox, and Daniel Christian Wahl for being our guest. This is Jennifer Sertl from Studio A3R in the Rigger.